"Eleanor, you don't belong here anymore," Logan said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. I stared at him across the hallway, my fingers brushing against the edge of the front door as if I could anchor myself to something solid. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, slicing thin lines across the hardwood floor, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny ghosts. The house smelled faintly of lilies from the funeral arrangements, still fresh and sad. I hadn't spoken yet, didn't know what to say, and perhaps that was the advantage. Logan didn't wait for a reply. He stepped aside, and the click of his key in the new lock echoed in the hall. My home, our home, suddenly felt foreign. I looked at the flower arrangements, the white and yellow blooms that were meant to comfort, but all I felt was the weight of absence pressing down. Each picture on the wall seemed to whisper memories of dinners, laughter, quiet conversations, of a husband who was no longer there to remind me that I belonged. I moved slowly toward the kitchen, my steps measured, as if mapping the space before it closed itself off to me. The refrigerator hummed quietly, a sound I had never noticed before, and I opened it to see the remains of last night's supper, untouched, waiting as if time had stopped. Logan's footsteps retreated upstairs, the soft carpet muffling each movement, and I stayed in the kitchen, tracing the counter edges with my fingertips, memorizing the surfaces, the little imperfections, the dents and scratches that had been invisible to anyone else, but spoke to decades of life lived here. I took a deep breath, imagining the weight of my grief folded neatly into boxes, stacked like old letters I might never open again. My hands lingered over the wooden cutting board, worn smooth from years of preparing meals, and I remembered the sound of my husband's voice, low and steady, reminding me to rest, to eat, to live. The sadness that threatened to spill over was held back by a quiet determination. I would not give Logan the satisfaction of seeing me falter. I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam curling upward like soft smoke, filling the room with the faint scent of chamomile, and I sat down at the kitchen table, my eyes tracing the pattern of the wood grain as if it could tell me where to begin. Outside, the wind stirred the trees gently, and I imagined the swaying branches as witnesses to what was unfolding, impartial and steady. I thought about the letters my husband had written over the years, the small notes tucked into drawers, reminders of love and care, and I understood that what Logan saw as weakness was a misjudgment. I sipped my tea slowly, listening to the faint tick of the wall clock, marking time that had always moved with its own rhythm in this house. And I realized that while locks could change, and rooms could feel different, the memories and the weight of decades could not be erased by a key. The grief was present, but it was tempered by the clarity that came from knowing that I would navigate this, not with anger, not with shouts, but with the quiet precision of someone who had lived long enough to understand the fragility of trust and the resilience of self. I traced my finger along the rim of my cup and then rested my hands on my lap, letting the silence stretch, filling every corner of the house with the echo of my presence, a quiet assertion that though the door might be locked, my resolve remained unlocked, unyielding, and quietly formidable. The house was quiet now. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of leaves against the windows. Eleanor moved through the room slowly, touching familiar surfaces as if she were marking her territory not with keys, but with memory. The dining table still held the remnants of the funeral flowers, petals beginning to wilt slightly at the edges, and she took a seat in the chair she had occupied for decades, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was a calmness in the still air, a temporary truce with the grief that sat heavy on her chest. She walked to the kitchen counter and ran her fingers over the smooth granite, recalling the countless meals prepared there, the laughter of family gatherings that once filled the space with warmth. Every cabinet and drawer held echoes of ordinary life, of quiet, moments that had shaped her days. She opened the silverware drawer, noticing how the light glinted off the polished utensils, the reflection reminding her that she was still present, still part of the life she had built. Outside, the wind carried a faint scent of autumn leaves, and the sunlight shifted through the windows, casting moving patterns on the floor that made her think of the passage of time, how things moved even when people did not. She picked up a mug and poured herself a small amount of tea, the steam curling in delicate spirals, and she sipped slowly, tasting the warmth that reminded her of mornings with her husband, quiet breakfasts with soft conversation. Eleanor moved toward the living room and sat on the couch, her eyes following the lines of the photographs on the walls, the smiles frozen in time, faces of loved ones and milestones, reminders of what had been, of what remained. She thought about Logan and Vivian, how easily they had shifted the balance in the house, how swiftly the ordinary order of life could be disrupted by intention and planning. There was a pang of disappointment, of sadness, yet beneath it was a clarity that came from years of experience, a knowledge that she would navigate this change with thoughtfulness and strategy rather than anger. Eleanor stood and walked to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of novels and albums, recalling evenings spent reading aloud, nights when her husband had shared stories and the house had been filled with light and calm. She lingered over each title, recognizing the stories she had lived alongside, and felt a quiet resolve settling in her chest. The day unfolded slowly, each movement measured, each breath deliberate, a rhythm Eleanor set for herself, an assertion that despite the shift in ownership and control, the essence of her life and her presence in this home could not be erased. She checked the rooms one by one, noting details that mattered, understanding that the small observations, the accumulation of time and care, gave her an enduring place in the house. In the afternoon light, she opened the blinds wider, letting the warmth fill the space, allowing herself a moment to acknowledge both the absence and the endurance of life. Eleanor walked back to the kitchen and began organizing the cabinets, straightening items, each action performed with quiet precision, a subtle declaration that she was still here, still capable, still unshaken. As the evening approached, she set the table for a simple meal, her movements steady and exact, a ritual that honored routine, stability, and the life she had built, preparing not just to exist, but to assert her presence in the days to come. As the afternoon sunlight shifted across the living room, Eleanor moved to the window and watched the shadows lengthen over the lawn, noticing the subtle movement of the trees as if they were the only witnesses to her solitude. The quiet was profound, almost tangible, filling every corner of the house where the echoes of recent days still lingered. She ran her hands along the arms of the sofa, feeling the texture of the fabric, the indentations left by countless hours spent in conversation, in reflection, in quiet moments of shared life with her husband. Each item in the room held meaning, each photograph a frozen memory, each trinket a reminder of love and care, of ordinary life lived fully and with intention. Eleanor opened the cabinet and examined the china, noting the fine patterns and the small chips that time had left, evidence of decades of use and presence. She prepared a simple tray with tea and biscuits, arranging everything with precision, the motion methodical, almost ceremonial. In the kitchen, the scent of freshly cleaned counters mingled with the faint fragrance of the wilting flowers, a contrast that highlighted the passage of time and the endurance of memory. She walked slowly through the hallways, touching the door frames, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingertips, grounding herself in the space that had been her sanctuary. The sunlight danced across the floorboards, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended, caught between light and shadow, a reminder of the quiet persistence of life even in stillness. Eleanor paused in front of the bookshelf, her eyes scanning the titles, recalling the evenings spent reading aloud, the gentle rhythms of storytelling, the calm that books had provided during times of uncertainty. She considered Logan and Vivian, their absence both physical and symbolic, the weight of their decisions, and the space they had created in the family dynamic. She felt a quiet sorrow, tempered by a deep-seated awareness that she could observe and act without haste, without overt confrontation. Eleanor returned to the living room, settling in her familiar chair, letting her gaze drift over the room, noting the subtle details that others might overlook, understanding that presence could be asserted without force, that observation could hold power. She sipped her tea slowly, appreciating the warmth and the routine, a counterbalance to the disarray of emotions and the shift in the household. Each breath, each movement was deliberate, a testament to resilience, to the quiet authority of a life fully lived. The afternoon waned, and Eleanor continued her careful navigation of the home, cataloging memories, preserving spaces, and affirming her place within the walls that had been built with care and filled with decades of life, understanding that patience and clarity would serve her as much as any immediate reaction. The late afternoon light slanted through the living room windows, casting long, narrow shadows across the hardwood floors. Eleanor moved from the couch to the windowsill, pressing her palm gently against the cool glass, feeling the faint vibration of the world outside while inside. Time seemed suspended. Each object in the room carried the weight of memory, a silent witness to the years she had spent cultivating a home filled with care, laughter, and quiet routines. She traced the edge of the coffee table with her fingers, noting the small scratches and marks that were invisible to anyone else, but spoke to decades of living fully. Her gaze shifted to the bookshelf, where photo albums and novels stood side by side, capturing snapshots of life and moments of quiet reflection. Eleanor thought about Logan and Vivian, their absence heavy in its meaning, the subtle shifts in tone and movement that revealed their priorities and ambitions, separate from the history of the home she had tended. She walked deliberately to the kitchen, noticing how the sunlight caught the edges of the counters and the silver handles of the cabinets, and she organized a small stack of dishes with careful, deliberate motions. The familiar sense of the home mingled with the fading fragrance of the funeral flowers, creating a space that was both comforting and tinged with melancholy. Eleanor paused near the dining table, her hand resting on the polished wood as she considered the many meals, holidays, and quiet evenings that had passed in this room. She reflected on the moments of joy and routine that had once seemed so ordinary, now highlighted by their absence, revealing the depth of her attachment to both the physical space and the shared history embedded in it. In the soft stillness, she felt a clarity rising from within, an understanding that her presence and her stewardship of the home could not be diminished by loss or absence, that the quiet dignity she maintained was a form of resilience. Eleanor poured herself another cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands and grounding her in the continuity of the day. She moved to a chair near the window and sat, eyes following the movement of the branches outside, the light changing slowly as evening approached, marking the passage of time that would continue, indifferent to human disputes. Her mind traced the lines of the house, the angles of the rooms, the spaces that had held her family, and she felt the subtle assertion of control and the meticulous attention she paid to these details. Each small action, every gesture performed with intention, reinforced her presence and her claim not just to the home, but to the narrative of her life within it. Eleanor sat quietly, sipping tea, watching shadows shift and deepen, allowing herself a measured pause to consider the next steps, the quiet strategies that would ensure that her voice and her existence remained acknowledged and respected, even in the absence of those who had temporarily claimed authority. The evening light softened as Eleanor moved through the living room, her eyes taking in every detail as if cataloging the space for a second. Memory, an assurance that she remained present and capable. The quiet tick of the wall clock marked each passing minute, and she felt the rhythm of her own heartbeat in tandem with it, a reminder of life continuing despite the recent upheaval. She walked toward the staircase, her fingers brushing along the railing, tracing familiar grooves, absorbing the texture of home. In the kitchen, she opened the pantry and examined the neatly arranged items, appreciating the order and stability they represented, a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence she had been navigating. The sunlight, now golden and warm, reflected off the polished surfaces, creating patterns that shifted with the changing angle, mirroring the subtle shifts in her awareness and understanding. Eleanor poured a fresh cup of tea, inhaling the gentle aroma, letting the warmth calm the tension that had accumulated in her chest, and she carried it to the living room where she sat quietly, savoring the simple act. She considered Logan and Vivian, the ways in which their actions had altered the household, the emotional distance that now existed, yet she felt a growing clarity in observing rather than reacting, a strategy of patience and measured response. Eleanor's gaze lingered on the photographs lining the mantel, images of family milestones, birthdays, and anniversaries, each one a testament to years of devotion and care, a reminder that her legacy was embedded in these moments and could not be erased by a single action or decision. She walked slowly to the window and pulled aside the curtain, letting the fading light illuminate the room fully. The glow revealing subtle details she had never noticed, the small imperfections and unique features that made the house hers. The quiet allowed her mind to wander, recalling conversations with her husband, the gentle reminders to take care of herself, the encouragement to savor small joys, and she felt a renewed sense of purpose in honoring those memories. Eleanor moved from room to room, touching familiar objects, rearranging them slightly, not out of necessity, but to affirm her connection to the environment and the life she had built. She noted the alignment of furniture, the placement of decorations, the subtle balance of order and familiarity, each adjustment a silent declaration of presence and care. As the evening deepened, the house filled with shadows and the golden glow of lamps, Eleanor sat once more at the kitchen table, resting her hands on the smooth surface, feeling the continuity of life and her enduring role within it. She allowed herself a slow, deliberate breath, acknowledging the solitude but embracing the quiet strength that had carried her through the day, understanding that while others might act impulsively or without thought, she had the wisdom and patience to navigate her world with dignity, precision, and unwavering presence. The late evening settled over the house, the glow from the lamps casting soft, golden light across the rooms, highlighting the familiar contours of furniture and the textures of fabrics Eleanor had chosen over the years. She moved through the living room slowly, allowing her fingers to brush along the edges of the sofa and coffee table, feeling the contours, the imperfections, the evidence of life lived and care given. The scent of chamomile tea lingered in the air, subtle and grounding, a reminder of the routines she had established that offered comfort amid uncertainty. Eleanor walked toward the hallway, pausing to observe the photographs that lined the walls, each frame capturing moments that had once seemed ordinary but now carried the weight of nostalgia and permanence. She lingered before an image of her husband, smiling softly at a family gathering, and she allowed herself a brief, silent acknowledgement of loss, a quiet recognition of what had been and what remained in memory. The house hummed with quiet life, appliances ticking faintly in the background, the faint creak of floorboards marking the passage of time, and she felt herself attuned to each sound, each detail, understanding that observation was a form of power, a means of presence that could not be removed by another's actions. Eleanor moved to the kitchen, arranging the counters with meticulous care, straightening dishes and utensils, aligning the cups and bowls in precise order, a gesture of calm control over her surroundings. She poured herself another cup of tea, the warmth sliding through her palms, a moment of focus, a grounding ritual that reminded her of the constancy of certain comforts even in the midst of disruption. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the trees, the shifting shadows falling across the floor in patterns that echoed the subtle shifts in her mind, the strategies forming quietly as she considered the next days and how she would maintain her presence in the household. Eleanor sat in the chair by the window, sipping slowly, letting the warmth infuse her body, her eyes following the subtle movements outside, noting the fading light, the changes in color, the gentle transition from day to night. She allowed herself to consider Logan and Vivian, their absence marked not by confrontation, but by the subtle rearrangement of space and attention, and she recognized the necessity of patience and measured observation, the understanding that power and influence often resided in quiet, deliberate presence rather than immediate reaction. She moved to the study, running her hands over the books and papers, noting small details, cataloging memories and objects, the textures of pages and bindings under her fingers, the familiar weight of notebooks and ledgers, each element affirming her continued role and enduring connection to the life she had nurtured. Eleanor returned to the living room, standing near the mantel, adjusting a vase slightly, realigning a frame, small motions of care and precision that served as reminders that she remained, that her attention and love for the household were undiminished, and that the quiet assertion of her presence was sufficient to maintain a measure of control and respect even in the absence of cooperation from those who sought to disrupt the equilibrium. She breathed deeply, appreciating the calm, the sense of order, and the continuity of life in her hands, preparing for the days ahead with measured patience and quiet determination, knowing that her strength was not loud but enduring, persistent, and undeniable. Night had settled over the house, and Eleanor moved through the quiet rooms with deliberate care, her footsteps light on the hardwood floors, the shadows from the lamps stretching long across the walls and ceiling. She paused at the entrance to the study, her hand lingering on the doorknob, feeling the familiar contours and textures that had held so many moments of her life, each one a testament to endurance and presence. The soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall marked time steadily, each tick a reminder of continuity and the persistence of life even in the face of recent disruption. Eleanor moved toward the window in the living room, lifting the curtains slightly and watching the faint glow of streetlights outside, the branches swaying gently in the cool night air, their shadows shifting across the carpeted floor. She settled into the armchair by the window, her tea warm in her hands, the steam rising in delicate tendrils, filling the air with a soothing aroma. She allowed herself to breathe, to observe, and to reflect on the subtleties of the day, the quiet actions and omissions of Logan and Vivian, the ways in which they had altered the rhythm of the household without loud declarations. Eleanor considered the photographs on the mantel, the frozen smiles of past holidays and birthdays, the images of her husband and family, and she felt the weight of those memories, a gentle gravity that anchored her in the present. She walked slowly to the kitchen, rearranging a few items with careful precision, not out of necessity, but as a silent assertion of presence and control, a reminder that the life she had built and nurtured was not diminished by loss or absence. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the subtle clink of the china, and the faint rustle of papers on the counter became a chorus of normalcy, a grounding in routine that contrasted with the emotional dissonance she had observed earlier. Eleanor moved to the hallway, her fingers tracing the edges of door frames, the grooves of the wood, marking each familiar texture, a silent map of home that belonged to her as much as anyone else. She paused near the photographs of Logan as a child, recalling the small moments of tenderness and guidance, the lessons quietly taught, the laughter and disagreements that shaped their lives, and she understood that observation and patience were her allies, more powerful than confrontation. As she returned to the living room, she arranged the cushions on the sofa, adjusted a small decorative item on the table, and straightened the placement of a lamp, each motion deliberate, each small act a reminder of order and continuity. Eleanor sipped her tea slowly, letting warmth and routine fill the spaces left by disruption, allowing herself to feel both grief and resolve in measured balance. The night deepened, the house settled into stillness, and Eleanor remained in her chair by the window, alert, observant, and quietly steadfast, understanding that the coming days required patience, clarity, and a steady presence, a measured engagement with a household in transition, a gentle but unyielding assertion of her enduring role and authority within the home. The early morning light filtered softly through the blinds, casting gentle stripes across the living room floor as Eleanor moved with measured steps, her hands brushing lightly over the surfaces she knew intimately. The house held a quiet stillness, the echoes of yesterday lingering faintly in the air, and she allowed herself to take stock of every detail, every corner that had witnessed decades of life and care. She moved to the mantel, adjusting the angle of a framed photograph, her fingers lingering on the glass, feeling the coolness beneath her touch, a small but deliberate act of presence. The faint scent of chamomile and the lingering fragrance of last evening's tea filled the kitchen, a comforting aroma that anchored her in the rhythm of daily life despite the underlying tension. Eleanor walked to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of familiar novels, recalling evenings spent immersed in stories, the gentle cadence of words read aloud, the quiet companionship of imagination and memory. Outside, the wind rustled the branches of the oak tree in the front yard, casting flickering shadows that moved slowly across the carpet, a gentle reminder that the world continued in its own rhythm. She paused at the dining table, noting the subtle imperfections. In the wood, each mark a testament to meals prepared, conversations shared, and the life that had been cultivated within these walls. Eleanor poured herself a fresh cup of tea, holding it carefully, allowing the warmth to seep into her palms, grounding her and lending clarity to her thoughts. She traced the patterns of sunlight shifting across the floor, observing the gentle changes of the day, and she considered the choices made by Logan and Vivian, the subtle maneuvers and quiet absences that had altered the dynamic of the household. Eleanor reflected on her own quiet responses, the patience and attention she maintained, understanding that measured observation and deliberate action held more influence than immediate reaction. She moved back toward the living room, adjusting a cushion on the sofa, aligning it with precision, and rearranging a small decorative item on the coffee table, each motion reinforcing her presence and quiet authority. The ticking of the wall clock continued, a steady reminder of the passage of time, each second an affirmation that the home still belonged to her as much as it had before, that her connection to the space and to memory remained intact. Eleanor settled into her armchair, sipping tea slowly, feeling the warmth and comfort of routine as the soft light continued to shift, illuminating familiar textures and surfaces. She allowed herself to consider the future with calm clarity, recognizing that patience and careful observation were her tools, that her quiet attention could shape the unfolding days as effectively as any confrontation. Each detail she noted, each deliberate gesture, reinforced a sense of stability and presence, and Eleanor understood that through quiet persistence, the household, and indeed the life she had built, remained hers to navigate with dignity, care, and unshakable resolve. The first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the familiar furnishings of Eleanor's home, highlighting the textures of rugs, the polished surfaces of tables, and the carefully placed keepsakes that marked the life she had built over decades. She moved quietly through the rooms, her fingers tracing the edges of counters, railings, and shelves, each contact a reassurance that she was present, that her connection to the space was enduring and deliberate. The house carried the residual sense of chamomile tea and faint traces of the flowers from recent ceremonies, a gentle reminder of past days and the rhythm of life that continued despite the recent shifts in household dynamics. Eleanor paused near the window, looking out at the garden bathed in soft morning light, the grass shimmering with dew, the branches of the oak trees swaying with the breeze, and she allowed herself to feel the continuity of life beyond the walls of the house, a world moving steadily as she observed with quiet attentiveness. She returned to the living room, straightening cushions on the sofa, aligning decorative items on tables, and adjusting frames on the mantel, each motion precise and purposeful, a silent assertion of her continued presence and influence. The photographs of family moments caught her attention again, the faces frozen in time offering memories of laughter, shared meals, and simple conversations, each one a reminder that her history and care could not be overlooked or undone by temporary absence or disregard. Eleanor moved to the kitchen to prepare a modest breakfast, arranging the utensils and setting the table with care, the repetition of these familiar tasks grounding her, providing structure and a sense of normalcy. She sipped her tea slowly, feeling warmth in her hands and clarity in her thoughts, recognizing the strength and patience, the power in measured observation, and the quiet resilience that had carried her through the years. She considered Logan and Vivian, the subtle actions and choices that had shifted the household dynamic, and she noted them without judgment, cataloging and understanding rather than reacting impulsively, aware that awareness and timing were her most effective tools. Eleanor walked through each room once more, noting the light, the shadows, the angles of furniture, and the placement of objects, allowing herself to absorb the totality of her environment, reaffirming that while change could occur, her presence and influence within the home remained steady and resilient. As morning deepened, she sat by the window once again, tea in hand, watching the world awaken outside, feeling a profound sense of clarity and quiet power, understanding that patience, attention, and deliberate action would guide her through the unfolding days, preserving her role, her dignity, and the life she had nurtured, unshaken by the decisions of others and grounded in the enduring strength of her experience and presence.